were eating dinner. Her last text before he killed her. There is a moment just before dawn when Westfield Green holds its breath. The town sits south of Glasgow, a planned community built in the aftermath of war, designed to offer working families something new: space, safety, community. Streets curve gently past low-rise flats and small gardens. Neighbors know each other's names. Children walk to school along predictable routes. It is the kind of place where people come to build lives, quietly, steadily, without drama. On the morning of Monday, November 18th, that peace shattered. A 999 call had come in, a man's voice, strangely flat, reporting something unimaginable. Police officers arrived at a ground-floor flat on Birchwood Close expecting a welfare check, perhaps a medical emergency. What they found instead would haunt them for years. Inside that flat lay the body of a 21-year-old woman. She had been dead for 2 days. Her name was Maisie Ashworth Lane, and the man who killed her had spent those 2 days driving her car, using her phone, and sending messages to her mother, pretending she was still alive. "We're eating dinner." Those were her last words to her mother, sent 2 days before her body was discovered, to a woman who believed her daughter was safe. What follows is the story of Maisie Ashworth Lane's life and death. It is a story of love that should have protected her, trust that was weaponized against her, and a cover-up so cold-blooded that even the defendant's own lawyer would call him the personification of evil. Beyond the crime itself, this is a story about the invisible dangers that grow in silence, the warning signs that slip past us, the questions we should have asked. This is a story that demands we pay attention, because Maisie deserved someone who was watching. Welcome to the True Crime File. This channel examines cases that demand understanding with respect for victims, commitment to accuracy, and belief that awareness can prevent tragedy. Before we begin, please note that some names, locations, and identifying details in this case have been changed to protect privacy and comply with legal restrictions. Now let us return to Westfield Green and to the life of a young woman named Maisie Ashworth Lane. It was a name her mother Diane chose with hope, and for 21 years, Maisie lived up to it. Growing up in South Lanarkshire as part of a close-knit family, she learned early that daily check-ins weren't obligations, but lifelines. The bond between Maisie and her mother was the kind some people spend lifetimes searching for, effortless, constant, woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. A message in the morning, a phone call after work, a quick text about dinner plans or a funny thing that happened on the bus. For Diane, these weren't interruptions. They were the heartbeat of her relationship with her daughter. Maisie made staying close feel natural. By 21, Maisie had found her place in the world, or at least she was building one. She worked as a waitress, a job that requires more than most people realize. It demands patience, memory, stamina, and the ability to remain warm when exhaustion tells you to withdraw. Maisie brought something extra to the role. Her co-workers would later remember her as someone who made difficult shifts feel lighter. When the kitchen backed up or a customer grew impatient, Maisie had a way of smoothing things over. She didn't complain. She didn't bring personal drama to work. She showed up, did her job well, and made the people around her feel seen. There's something important in that detail, something worth sitting with for a moment, because victims of violence are so often reduced to their victimhood. We learn how they died before we learn who they were. The horror becomes the whole story, but Maisie was a person first, a daughter, a co-worker, a friend. A young woman who had mastered the art of showing up with kindness, even when the world didn't make it easy. That matters. It matters because it tells us what was stolen. She had dreams, though court proceedings revealed little about what they were. At 21, most dreams are still forming, still finding their shape. Maybe Maisie imagined a different career someday. Maybe she thought about travel, about education, about the kind of life she wanted to build. We don't know, because she never got the chance to tell us. What we do know is that she was loved deeply, consistently, without condition. Her mother waited for her messages. Her co-workers looked forward to her shifts. Her friends counted on her steadiness. Maisie had become the kind of person others relied upon, and she carried that responsibility gently, without complaint. And then, 2 years before her death, she met a man named Callum Harrington. At a family gathering, accounts suggest a party where extended circles overlapped. Maisie and Callum were introduced. He was 25 at the time. She was 19. 6 years between them. Not unusual, not alarming. Just a gap that, in hindsight, created a subtle imbalance neither of them might have noticed. They talked, they connected, they began dating, and within a relatively short time, they moved in together, into the flat on Birchwood Close where Maisie would eventually die. From the outside, everything looked normal. A young couple navigating the early years of adult life. Jobs, rent, routines, the small negotiations that come with sharing space. There were no police calls, no reported incidents, and no public signs that anything was wrong. But here is what makes intimate partner violence so difficult to see and so dangerous to ignore. It rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs or clear-cut villains. Instead, it grows in the spaces between words, in complaints that seem harmless, in small moments of control dressed up as concern, in patterns that develop so gradually that the person living inside them can't see the walls closing in. On the day Maisie died, prosecutors revealed something that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Callum Harrington had complained to her that her waitress shifts made him feel lonely. Consider what that statement asks of the person hearing it. It doesn't demand anything outright threaten or overtly control, but it does something subtler. It makes Maisie responsible for his emotional state. It ties her independence, her work, her income, her sense of self to his comfort, and it creates a quiet pressure to prioritize his needs over her own. We cannot know whether this complaint was isolated or part of a pattern that had accumulated over months, even years, shaping the relationship in ways neither of them fully understood. What we do know is that on the night of Friday, November 15th, Maisie came home from work. She sat down to dinner with the man she trusted. She sent a message to her mother. "We're eating dinner." And somewhere in the hours that followed, the resentment Callum had been carrying exploded into violence no one could have predicted. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must also examine the man at its center. Not to excuse him, but to comprehend how someone becomes capable of such destruction. What follows is analysis based on available evidence and established patterns of behavior in similar cases. It represents interpretation, not established fact. Callum Harrington was 27 years old. He worked as a postman, a job defined by routine, repetition, and solitude. Every morning, the same routes, the same houses, the same mechanical rhythm of footsteps and letterboxes. For many people, such work provides stability, structure, a predictable frame around which the rest of life can be built. But for others, that same routine can become a kind of cage, monotonous hours that leave too much space for thoughts to spiral inward. And we know remarkably little about Callum's inner life before the murder. No extensive history of violence was reported, no prior criminal record that made headlines. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared unremarkable, quiet, perhaps reserved, but not obviously dangerous. That's the disturbing truth that cases like this force us to confront. The most dangerous people aren't always the ones who look dangerous. They don't wear their capacity for violence on the surface. Instead, it grows in silence, fed by resentment, insecurity, or something darker that never finds an outlet until it's too late. What drew Callum to Maisie? The court record doesn't fully answer that question, but we can observe the dynamics that emerged. At the time they met, Maisie was 19, still discovering who she was, still forming her adult identity. Callum was 25, more settled, more certain of his routines and expectations. That gap, 6 years, can mean everything or nothing, depending on the people involved. For Maisie, the years with Callum were years of growth. She worked steadily, she maintained close ties with her family, she built friendships, she was becoming someone, gradually, naturally, in the way young people do when they're allowed to develop without interference. As Maisie expanded her world, finding fulfillment in work and relationships, did Callum feel his own world contracting? Did her independence begin to feel to him like abandonment? We're speculating here, and it's important to acknowledge that. The court record doesn't give us access to Callum's psychology beyond the fragments that emerged during trial. But the pattern that prosecutors described, the complaints about loneliness, the resentment toward her work schedule, the possessive undertones, suggests a man whose sense of self had become dangerously entangled with his partner's presence. Whether Maisie recognized these patterns, or whether they were even visible from inside the relationship, we cannot know. What we do know with certainty is that recognizing danger is not the same as being responsible for preventing it. The responsibility for violence lies solely with the person who commits it. No amount of love, patience, or trust could have protected Maisie from what came next. Friday, November 15th. The day began like any other. Maisie woke in the flat on Birchwood Close. Outside, the Scottish autumn had settled into its gray November routine. Short days, long shadows, almost the kind of chill that makes home feel precious. She had work that day. Another shift at the restaurant, where she'd built a reputation for reliability and warmth. Another day of carrying plates and greeting customers and doing the ordinary work that kept her life moving forward. At some point during the day, she saw her mother. Diane would later describe her daughter as being in good spirits. There was nothing unusual about the visit. No tension, no warning signs, no sense that anything was wrong. Just a mother and daughter sharing time together, the way they always did. Perhaps they exchanged the kind of words that needed no weight. How's work? Busy but fine? Call me later? Always. The kind of conversation that happens between people who know they'll talk again tomorrow. Maisie finished her shift and returned home to Birchwood Close. The evening stretched ahead, dinner, rest, maybe television or conversation. The unremarkable hours that fill a life between work and sleep. At 21:37 to 9:37 in the evening, she sent her mother a message. We're eating dinner. 4 words, simple, unremarkable. The kind of update that happens between parents and children a million times a day. Maisie had no way of knowing these would be her last words to her mother. The following section contains references to violence. Specific details have been omitted out of respect for the victim and her family. What happened inside that flat over the next several hours exists only in fragments. Testimony, forensic evidence, the statements of a man whose account would later prove unreliable. Sometime around midnight, when a downstairs neighbor heard loud noises, hurried footsteps, the kind of sounds that register at the edge of consciousness, Noticed, but not alarming enough to investigate. At the time, it meant nothing. Noise happens in flats. People drop things, couples argue, televisions play too loud. The neighbor went back to whatever they were doing, unaware that the sounds they'd heard were marking the end of a young woman's life. Meanwhile, Callum's phone was recording something else. A fitness app, running quietly in the background, tracked his steps throughout the night. Later, investigators would analyze that data and find a spike, a sudden burst of movement that aligned with the neighbor's report. Chaos captured in numbers. A death translated into data points. What exactly happened inside that flat and in what sequence is not something we will describe in detail. The violence that ended Maisie's life was severe enough that even the presiding judge would later call it appalling and horrible. Prosecutors made clear that she suffered, that the attack was sudden, brutal, and sustained. But dwelling on those details serves no purpose except to sensationalize something that deserves gravity instead. What matters is this. Maisie Ashworth Lane, 21 years old, full of life and love and possibility, was killed by someone she trusted, in a home that should have been her refuge. She died alone with her killer. And for the next 2 days, no one knew. When dawn broke on Saturday, November 16th, Maisie Ashworth Lane had been dead for hours. Her mother didn't know. Her friends didn't know. Her co-workers expected her for her next shift, whenever that was. Life outside the flat on Birchwood Close continued as normal, unaware that within those walls, something unimaginable had occurred. And inside the flat, Callum Harrington was alone with the consequences of what he had done. What happens inside the mind of someone who has just committed murder? Panic? Denial? Cold calculation? Perhaps some combination of all three. The psychological literature describes various responses. Some killers collapse immediately. Others enter a dissociative state. Still others begin methodically planning their escape. For Callum, the hours that followed the murder were marked by something that would later shock investigators and devastate Maisie's family. An attempt to continue living as though nothing had happened. He didn't call the police. He didn't call for help. He didn't turn himself in. Instead, he picked up Maisie's phone. Over the course of Saturday, November 16th and Sunday, November 17th, prosecutors would later reveal that Callum used that phone extensively. He searched the internet over 170 times. The nature of those searches, primarily pornographic content, suggests Callum was trying desperately to find distraction, escape, some facsimile of normalcy in the midst of horror. But his activity didn't stop there. He drove Maisie's car, the vehicle she had used to get to work, the car that represented her independence, her mobility, her ability to move through the world on her own terms. He took the keys, got behind the wheel, and then drove through the same streets she had driven, while her body remained in the flat they had shared. A neighbor might have seen him leave, might have waved, perhaps, or simply noted the red Corsa pulling away. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just a man going about his day. No one knew. But the cruelest deception, the one that would devastate Maisie's family more than almost any other detail, was yet to come. Diane, Maisie's mother, was sending messages. "How are you, love? Everything okay? Give me a call when you can." The kind of messages mothers send when they haven't heard back. Not worried yet, just checking in, just maintaining the connection that had defined their relationship for 21 years. And responses came back. Messages that suggested Maisie was fine. Busy maybe, distracted, but alive, present. just around the corner from the next phone call, the next visit, the next moment of connection. Those messages were lies. Callum Harrington, sitting in the flat where he had killed his girlfriend, typed responses pretending to be her. He impersonated the daughter Diane was waiting to hear from. He manufactured reassurance while the truth lay in the room behind him. For 2 days, Diane lived in a world where her daughter was still alive. She sent messages expecting Maisie to read them. She made plans assuming there would be more conversations, more visits, more ordinary moments together. She went to sleep on Saturday and Sunday night believing her daughter was safe. That hope was manufactured. Those 2 days of peace, false peace, arc built on lies, were stolen from her just as surely as Maisie was stolen from her. Before we continue, it's worth pausing to understand what the law calls attempting to defeat the ends of justice. This is not merely hiding from responsibility, it's an active effort to prevent the truth from being discovered, to manipulate evidence, deceive investigators, and obstruct the legal process that exists to hold people accountable for their actions. In Scottish law, this is a serious offense in its own right. It reflects not just guilt, but calculation. It shows that the person responsible understood the gravity of what they had done and chose deception over confession. For Callum Harrington, that deception took multiple forms, using Maisie's phone to impersonate her, driving her car to create an illusion of normalcy, or searching the internet extensively, perhaps to find distraction, perhaps to research his options, attempting to obtain drugs, possibly to build a later defense of intoxication, and physically staging the scene in ways that investigators would later document. Each of these actions added time to the clock. Every hour that passed without discovery was another hour Maisie's family lived in false hope. Another hour evidence could degrade. Another hour for Callum to construct his story. When he finally called 999, 2 full days after the murder, he had a narrative ready. He claimed psychosis. He blamed cocaine, alcohol, and steroids. He said he had blacked out and couldn't remember what happened, but the evidence would tell a different story. A delivery driver who encountered Callum on the night of the murder described him as appearing completely sober, not confused, not impaired, not in the grip of any obvious mental health crisis, just normal. That testimony would prove crucial in court, because if Callum was sober enough to appear normal to a stranger just hours before or after the murder, then his claims of psychotic blackout became much harder to believe. The cover-up wasn't the act of someone who didn't know what he was doing. It was the calculated response of someone who knew exactly what he had done and hoped he might get away with it. 2 days. 48 hours of silence, deception, and denial, and then finally a phone call. At some point on Monday, November 18th, Callum Harrington picked up the phone and dialed 999. And the call came only after every other option had been exhausted. 2 days after a phone call might have saved investigators time and spared Maisie's family 2 days of manufactured hope. What Callum said in that call would become central to the case against him. He claimed he had experienced a psychotic episode. He blamed the combination of cocaine, alcohol, and anabolic steroids. He said he had blacked out and couldn't clearly remember what had happened. But then came a phrase that prosecutors would highlight throughout the trial, a phrase that suggested something very different from uncontrollable psychosis. According to court records, Callum told the operator, "I was mustering up the courage to phone." Mustering up the courage. Those words carry weight. If Callum had truly experienced a psychotic break, yes, would he have needed 2 days to muster courage Would he have been capable of impersonating Maisie, driving her car, searching the internet over 170 times? His own words suggest a man who knew what he had done and spent 2 days working up the nerve to face the consequences. The 999 call brought emergency services to Birchwood Close. For Maisie's family, the next few hours would bring a devastation beyond imagination. The messages they thought were from their daughter, lies. The reassurance they'd felt, manufactured. The hope that everything was fine, shattered. What officers found inside that flat would stay with them. Maisie's body was discovered in the hallway. She had been partially covered, a detail that might suggest remorse or might simply reflect Callum's inability to face what he had done. 3 blood-stained knives were recovered from different rooms in the flat. The scene told a story of violence that moved through the space, that wasn't confined to a single moment of rage, but played out over time and distance. Callum himself showed what officers described as emotional detachment. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't breaking down, he was calm in a way that seemed disconnected from the horror around him. During his arrest, he made statements that would later prove significant. "I could not stay here with her like that. I tried to," he paused, "move her. And then, I guess this is what my next 25 years look like." 25 years. A number that suggested he had already been calculating, already been thinking about sentences, about consequences, about the legal machinery that was about to consume his life. Not what have I done, not how could this happen, but how long will I pay for this? The Scottish legal system, like all systems of justice, moves at its own pace. It gathers evidence, it interviews witnesses, it builds cases piece by piece until a full picture emerges. For Maisie Ashworth Lane's family, this process must have felt agonizing, waiting for answers while grief demanded immediate resolution. But the wheels turned, and eventually Callum Harrington stood before the High Court in Glasgow to face judgment for what he had done. He faced 2 charges: murder and attempting to defeat the ends of justice. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the timeline. The final message at 21:37 on Friday, or November 15th. The neighbor's report of loud noises and hurried footsteps around midnight. The spike in Callum's step count captured by his phone's fitness app. The 2 days of silence, deception, and impersonation that followed. They presented the forensic evidence. The 3 knives recovered from different rooms, each bearing traces of violence. The scene that officers found when they finally entered the flat. They presented the delivery driver's testimony, a witness who had encountered Callum on the night of the murder and described him as appearing completely sober and normal, not impaired, not psychotic. Just a man going about his evening as though nothing was wrong. And they presented the evidence of cover-up. The over 170 internet searches. The messages sent pretending to be Maisie, in the car driven through streets where she would never drive again. The 2-day delay before finally calling emergency services. Together, these pieces formed an overwhelming picture, not just of guilt, but of calculation. This was not a man who had lost control and immediately sought help. This was a man who had tried to escape consequences before finally accepting that he couldn't. The defense, presented by Michael Brennan KC, that's King's Counsel, a senior barrister, faced an impossible task. There was no viable argument for innocence. The evidence was too clear. The defendant's own statements admitted too much. The cover-up activities demonstrated awareness and intent that couldn't be explained away. And so, remarkably, the defense made no attempt to deny the fundamental facts. Instead, Yet Brennan stood before the court and acknowledged the truth in terms rarely heard in criminal proceedings. In an extraordinary moment, he told the judge that Maisie's family would likely view Callum as, and these are the defense counsel's exact words, the personification of evil. The personification of evil. Those are not words defense attorneys typically use to describe their clients. They are not words that suggest mitigating circumstances or diminished responsibility. They are words that acknowledge the fundamental horror of what occurred and the impossibility of excusing it. Through his lawyer, Callum stated that he could never forgive himself for what he had done. Whether that statement reflects genuine remorse or simply recognition of his hopeless legal position, we cannot know. What we know is that it changed nothing for the woman he killed and offered no comfort to the family he devastated. Presiding over the case was Lord Henderson, a senior figure in the Scottish judiciary whose words would carry the weight of the law's judgment. Lord Henderson had presided over many serious cases in his career. He had seen violence, deception, and the full range of human cruelty that passes through criminal courts. In addressing this case, Lord Henderson chose language that reflected something beyond routine gravity. He called the crime appalling and horrible, not complex legal terms, but simple words anyone might use to describe something that defies comprehension. Callum Harrington was convicted on both charges, murder and attempting to defeat the ends of justice. Sentencing was scheduled for July 14th, 2025, a date that would bring legal closure, if not emotional healing. Inside the courtroom, watching every moment of testimony, sat the people who loved Maisie most. Her mother Diane, family members, friends, people who had known her laugh, her warmth, her quiet determination, people who had received her messages, shared her meals, looked forward to seeing her again. Now they sat in a courtroom, listening to a man describe the details of her death and the days he spent pretending she was still alive. Words like devastating and unimaginable appear in news reports, but they are placeholders, sounds that gesture towards something language cannot truly hold. The loss of a child is already beyond most people's ability to comprehend. But to lose a child like this, to violence, to betrayal, to a cover-up that extended false hope before shattering it, adds layers of trauma that will take years to process. For Diane, the messages will never stop hurting. Every time she looks at her phone, she will remember the 2 days of false hope. Messages she thought were reaching her daughter, read instead by her daughter's killer. Maisie's family asked for privacy during the trial. We honor that request by limiting our discussion to matters of public record. But we can say this with certainty. Maisie was loved, deeply, consistently, unconditionally. Her family's presence in that courtroom, through every difficult detail, every painful revelation, testified to that love more powerfully than any words could. They were there for her when she lived. They were there for her when the truth emerged. And they will carry her memory forward, long after the legal proceedings have concluded and the public attention has moved elsewhere. Maisie Ashworth Lane was 21 years old. She worked hard at a job that demanded patience and grace. She maintained a relationship with her mother that many people only dream of having. She brought light into rooms, according to those who knew her. She showed up for the people who counted on her. She had decades of life ahead of her, birthdays not yet celebrated, friendships not yet formed, experiences not yet had, a future full of possibility that was stolen before she could see it unfold. No sentence can restore that future. No conviction can bring her back. The justice system can only acknowledge what was taken. It cannot replace it. But her story can serve a purpose if we let it. It can remind us to pay attention. In the weeks and months following a case like this, questions linger, not just about what happened, but about what it means. Why did this happen? What could have prevented it? And perhaps most unsettling, how many other relationships contain similar dangers that haven't yet revealed themselves? Let's be clear about something. This case does not offer easy lessons. There is no evidence that Maisie missed obvious warning signs. There is no indication that family or friends saw danger and failed to act. From all accounts, the relationship appeared normal, unremarkable even, until the night it ended in murder. This is the terrifying reality of intimate partner violence. It doesn't always announce itself. As the most dangerous relationships aren't always the ones that look dangerous from the outside. But that doesn't mean we're helpless. Research into intimate partner violence has identified patterns, not guarantees, but patterns that can sometimes signal risk. Possessive behavior disguised as devotion. Resentment toward a partner's independence, their work, their friendships, their family connections. Comments that make one partner responsible for the other's emotional state. Isolation, even subtle isolation, from support networks. An escalation during times of stress or change. Callum's complaint about Maisie's work shifts making him lonely fits this pattern. It didn't demand anything outright. It didn't threaten. But it planted a seed. A suggestion that her independence was harming him. That her choices were responsible for his emotions. We cannot know whether this comment was isolated or part of a larger pattern. We cannot know whether Maisie recognized it as concerning or dismissed it as normal relationship friction. We cannot know what might have happened if someone had seen the warning and intervened. What we can do is pay attention to our own relationships and to the relationships of people we love. If someone in your life is gradually becoming isolated from family and friends, if that person's partner seems resentful of their job, their hobbies, their independence, if they seem to be taking responsibility for their partner's emotional state, apologizing for working too much, staying out too long, having friends of their own, these may not be emergencies, they may be nothing. But they are worth noticing, worth asking gentle questions about, worth keeping an eye on, even when everything looks fine on the surface. Because sometimes the people in danger can't see it clearly themselves, and sometimes the people watching from outside are the only ones positioned to notice the pattern. Maisie Ashworth Lane should be alive today. She should be getting ready for work, sending messages to her mother, making plans for the weekend. She should be 22 now, moving deeper into adulthood, discovering who she wanted to become. Instead, her life ended at 21, in a flat that should have been her refuge, at the hands of someone she trusted completely. There is nothing we can do to change that. There is no narrative trick, no twist ending, no last-minute revelation that makes the outcome different. This is true crime in its rawest form. A young woman full of promise, destroyed by violence that came without adequate warning. But there is something we can do for Maisie. We can remember her as she was, not as a victim, but as a person. The daughter who messaged her mother every day, maintaining a bond that many people only dream of. The co-worker who made difficult shifts feel lighter, who showed up with warmth, even when the work was hard. The young woman who was still discovering herself, still finding her path, still growing into the adult she was meant to become. That is who Maisie was. Not the crime that ended her life, not the violence she suffered, not the horror that filled the courtroom. She was a person who deserved more time, more chances, More ordinary days full of work and messages and dinners with people she loved. Her family will carry her memory forward. In quiet moments and loud gatherings, in photographs and stories, in the empty space that will never quite fill, Maisie will remain present. And for those of us who never knew her, she can serve a different purpose. Maisie can be the reason we pay closer attention, the reason we ask that uncomfortable question when something seems wrong, the reason we don't dismiss the small concerns as probably nothing, because sometimes those small concerns are everything. Callum Harrington will face sentencing on July 14th, 20 to 25. Whatever years the court assigns, they will not restore what was taken. They will not heal the wounds he caused. They will not bring Maisie back. But they will mark a moment of accountability, a moment when the legal system acknowledges that what happened was wrong and that there must be consequences. For Maisie's family, that moment will bring some form of closure, though never the kind they truly need. And for the rest of us, this case leaves questions that deserve our attention. How well do we really know the people we trust? How much do we notice about the relationships around us? And if someone we love was in danger, would we see it in time? Maisie was 21. She was loved. She deserved more time. May she rest in peace. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, help is available. In Scotland, you can contact the Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage Helpline at 0800 027 1234. For Police Scotland, you dial 101 for non-emergency situations or 999 for emergencies. You can also reach Scottish Women's Aid at womensaid.scot. For UK-wide support, the National Domestic Violence Helpline is available at 0808 200 0247. Refuge can be reached at refuge.org.uk, and the Men's Advice Line is available at 08 0880100327. You are not alone. Help is available. Thank you for watching the True Crime File. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you to pay attention to the people in your life, please consider subscribing to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps us continue telling these stories. Stories that matter, stories that demand to be heard, stories that might just save a life. Leave a comment below and tell us, what questions does this case raise for you? Until next time, stay aware, stay connected, and look out for one another.